The first prophet we're going to cover together is probably the most famous, the biggest, and probably most significant, known as Isaiah. And Isaiah lived from around 740 to about 687 BCE. And we actually know this because Isaiah references a number of kings that he served under, as well as documents some historical events, which this gives us a good idea of when he lived and what was happening at the time. So if you remember from introduction, remember each prophet lived at a real time in history that you can often compare to and show. You can see where Isaiah lived when studying 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles. So there's a historical reality that comes into play when he writes. Now, to be fair, it should be said right up front that Isaiah is quite simply massive in theological scope, significance. Is even a big book to just read. It certainly can't be reduced to just one or two ideas or themes. It's almost impossible. I try to in a survey video like this just to give you the highlights. Isaiah is hard to give you the highlights to. Honestly, it can be hard not to get lost in a book like this amidst the overall length and just trying to fit it into a course like this. Isaiah is the most often cited book in the New Testament, including by Jesus, and it demands a lot more than I think we can give in such a short time. You could honestly teach an entire seminary course just on the book of Isaiah, but we'll at least look at what are some of the big ideas. What could you pull out? What rises to the top, as this is probably the biggest, most important things he comes to, and how's the book put together? Hopefully, I can help you grasp what the book is essentially about and the role it plays in the overall story of the Bible, if not being able to dive into all the intricate details, which there's just no way we could. So one thing I want to do with each of these videos for the prophets is start by looking at the historical context. What was going on? When did this prophet live, and what was happening that led them to make the prophecies they did? So as a book, Isaiah does two basic things. First, it looks forward to Israel's judgment, right? So it was written before they fell. So we can tell right off the bat, when you go back and read 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles, you can see that the south fell to Assyria, then eventually the north falls to Babylon. Isaiah is writing before the fall because he's predicting it. He's saying it's going to happen. But then Isaiah also speaks beyond the fall and the exile to a future redemption from exile and the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. So to really grasp the overall message of the book, you need to understand some of the really important historical moments of Israel's history that these ideas revolve around. So you can go back and reread 1st and 2nd Kings, Chronicles, but I'm just going to give you some ideas to consider right here now. So Isaiah lived and prophesied during the dominance of the Assyrian Empire. They were the world power of the day and age that he lived in. And he wrote most of this book after they had already conquered the northern kingdom. And remember, Israel split in half into the north Israel and the south Judah. And the Assyrians were now threatening Judah in the south as well. So the north had fallen into sin, and much sooner, worse, and they were conquered 150 years before the south, known as Judah, fell. So this takes place during that span. So the north falls to Assyrian Empire. The south of Judah is still hanging on, but the Assyrians are powerful and they've turned their eye to Judah. They want to come and attack and conquer them as well. There's a king named Uzziah who has died. 2nd Kings 15 tells us that. And Isaiah even tells us, connects King Uzziah to his own life and his calling. And this marks the end of a relatively peaceful time for Judah, the southern kingdom, and the beginning of the end for them as well. It's all going to go downhill from here. So the Assyrian Empire is crushing all their enemies, and they're now focusing in on Jerusalem, in this last holdout of the Israelite people. And during this time, Judah's kings waffled back and forth. Remember, we go back and reread 2nd Kings, kind of a good king and a bad king. Okay, good, right? Back and forth. And they're going back and forth between paying Assyria to leave them alone, trying to buy them off, or trusting in God to protect them, ultimately surviving them, but falling to the empire that would take their place, Babylon. So eventually Babylon would rise to power, conquer Assyria, and Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar would come in and take Judah as well. And this is the event that Isaiah actually predicts will happen in this book. So it hasn't happened yet. He's prophesying before Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon come. So in the first half, Isaiah begins by telling the people this is going to happen, making it clear why. So remember I talked about how the purpose of the prophets was to call people back to faithfulness, to remind them of the covenant. Isaiah's like, this is coming because you failed, because you've rejected your promise. Then in the second half of his book, he sees beyond their fall and the exile in Babylon and offers hope for future restoration. It's thus both a warning and judgment given their current situation, and it's a promise of hope and redemption regarding their future. It does both of these things in this sort of a massive work. Dealing with a predicament that has not yet happened, but also what's coming after it, all in the same book. Confused? Well, okay. It's okay. This is a really deep book. There's a lot to it. So it's okay. Again, this is a survey class. We're not trying to like break down the nuance. I'll just give you the big picture. Isaiah is prophesying coming destruction, but hope beyond it. So let's turn from the historical setting now to the overall theology of Isaiah's message. What is it? What are his big ideas that he's trying to communicate? And Isaiah makes a number of important and minor points of theology. There's a lot of different things in it throughout 66 chapters that make up the book. However, again, because we're covering the whole thing just in one quick video, I want us to catch the really big emphases that he makes that repeat over and over to represent his most dominant theological issues. So there's a lot of them, but I'm just going to give you three. Here's three big ideas that come from this huge, important prophetic book that starts the whole work of the prophets in the Old Testament. And I'm going to break it down this way. First, a theme you see a lot is the Holy One. And Isaiah likes that phrase. Throughout this book, he repeatedly uses this phrase. And he does this to remind his readers just who this God truly is. Because remember, prophets are reminding, they're calling people back. Isaiah wants to remind people that God is the all-powerful creator who shakes the foundations of the world with the power of his voice. He's immense, incomprehensible, not to be taken lightly. God alone, is God, and idols are worthless. You shouldn't be worshiping anyone else. You shouldn't be relying on anybody else. You shouldn't be turning to anybody else for your hope, for your future, for your protection. Like, God can do everything. He's all powerful. There are no rivals to who God is. And Isaiah even makes fun of people who worship false idols. And this is important. This is an important tie back to our study of the word holy in the Torah. Isaiah is calling the people to remember who God is and how important it is to keep him as God in our lives. Calling him holy points to his character, his moral and ethically pureness and goodness. God is faithful, righteous, just. He's merciful. The people cannot forget who he is and grow complacent with his presence among them, which, unfortunately, they have. For Isaiah, the people have lost sight of the Holy One. The people have forgotten how important God is, how big he is, and they've turned to other things, and it's leading to destruction. So turning their minds back to how big God is and who he is, and how holy he is and how seriously he should be taken. The people have wandered and strayed, and they need to be reminded of it. And then secondly, to themselves, a reminder that they're to be a holy people. This is nothing new to us who have been studying this idea throughout this course. We've been seeing this again and again, looking out throughout their history. But for Isaiah, the people he was speaking to seem to have forgotten, or at least stopped caring. God expects his people to be holy and to reflect his character, to live a certain way. The whole purpose of calling Israel was that they'd be different and unique, live differently and stand out and shine his glory to the world. And remember, this was the basic command given in the Torah. Take on God's character, represent him to the nations. And Isaiah repeats this idea constantly as he condemns the people for not living this out and representing God well. They're failing at this mission. The world around them is not seeing the glory of God. They're just seeing Israel's looking like everybody else, being unfaithful and not representing him well. They're not bringing glory to God's name. Israel is the place where God has built his temple and given his word and made his dwelling place. And these, the Jewish people, are the people who are called to represent him as priests to all the nations and all the world. It's the place that was supposed to start hope and healing for the entire creation, and that the world was supposed to look on with envy and want to know this one true God. But for Isaiah, instead, they've just turned their back on God, and now they're a laughingstock. And, they're being disowned for their failure. For Isaiah, he's like, we have failed. We have not done what we were supposed to do. We have not been loyal and true and trustworthy the way that God has called us to. And because of that, now we're going to suffer the consequences. Now we're going to experience what God said we would experience if we did this. Isaiah is prophesying, you haven't taken the Holy One serious. You haven't been holy yourselves. And now you're getting kicked out of the garden. You're going to lose it all because of that. But that's not the end. Because even though God must punish our wayward sin, Isaiah says, he's not going to give up on us. But eventually he's going to do what he promised. And I want to kind of nuance this a little bit. A third and final thing. This is my language. This isn't Isaiah's language, a coming Messiah. And I want to make sure that clear because Isaiah doesn't use the word Messiah. But he does speak of a suffering servant, a leader, someone who will come and restore and lead the people out. The term Messiah would eventually get applied to that. So I'm just using it here. Isaiah is pointing to this coming figure who would lead the people the right way. A faithful king who would accomplish God's purposes, who would see God as the Holy One and truly follow him and be holy himself and lead us in it. And so the idea of a good and faithful king servant who would come and represent the people like Moses, bring about a second Exodus. And we're going to go back into slavery for a season, but it's not going to last forever. And God is going to bring us back out of it. And so these are the three big ideas that Isaiah wants to turn people's eyes back to the bigness and the holiness of God, to remind each individual that they're called to be holy as well. And because they haven't, bad things are coming, but the bad things aren't going to last forever. And eventually a truly good and wise ruler will come. So Isaiah is often quoted when you get in the New Testament, the prophecies about Jesus and stuff, is a lot of it is in Isaiah. So that's kind of the big ideas. There's a lot to unpack there. Again, this is a survey, quick overview. But let's kind of walk through the way the book is put together. Isaiah is broken up, I would say, into two main sections. Some scholars believe three. I would just say it's divided pretty clearly by history. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's the first section is everything that happens before the exile. It's Isaiah looking ahead to this coming tragedy, this disaster that's about to come to them, announcing the coming destruction. And then you have the section 2 is sort of looking beyond it, towards the hope and the second Exodus, the return back from this exile. They were likely written at different points in Isaiah's life. There are those who wrestle with whether some parts of Isaiah maybe were written by somebody else later. I don't know about that. We don't know. But it does at least appear that maybe the beginning was written early in his life and the later was written later. It's possible that the latter half Isaiah, and this is very realistic, it's possible that maybe parts of it were written while he was alive. And then after he died, the latter half were things that he actually said, but then they were finally written down and recorded after he passed away. And that's why they look like they came later, or maybe have a slightly different style in the writing. Not a huge important thing to worry about, but just think there's really two sections. There's looking to the coming destruction, and there's looking beyond it, section 1, section 2. So let's start with section 1, really Isaiah announcing and prophesying coming destruction. It speaks of Jerusalem during the period of the Assyrian threat. So the Assyrians are bearing down on them. And God actually saves the people because of a king named Hezekiah. And you can read about this in 2 Kings. Hezekiah is a faithful king who does the right thing. And God says, okay, well, I'm going to hold off destruction because of you. But at the same time, Isaiah says, this is just temporary. God's judgment is still going to come on Judah. And because these people have ultimately failed. They haven't trusted him completely. They have flirted with idols and other gods. They've ignored social justice. They've not trusted fully in the Holy One. So there's a temporary reprieve. Assyria is not going to destroy you, but destruction is coming. So the first 6 chapters is basically God's complaint and Isaiah's calling. It's important to include a calling because Isaiah has to justify that he's a prophet. Look, this event happened in the year the king Uzziah died. I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and he called me and said, who shall I send? Isaiah is showing I am a prophet. And what he told me to do was come and tell you people that you've rejected your calling to be holy. You've neglected the poor and innocent. You've turned to idols. You've thus become like the idols you've been worshiping. You're neither seeing nor hearing. You're basically dead. Therefore, God has called me to come and confront you and call you to account for it. Chapter 7 through 12, you have this King Ahaz who lacks trust in God. Isaiah gives multiple warnings against Israel and their neighbor nations, who Israel has relied on instead of God. They've turned to other nations for help rather than turning to God. And at the core is the decision of the king, and whether ultimately they would rely on God and be faithful, be holy people, trusting in the Holy One. And the first is a king named Ahaz who's facing a foreign invader. And God spoke through Isaiah to tell him he'll be saved. However, Ahaz doesn't believe him, and his lack of trust is a picture of what's wrong with the whole nation. And this points the way for the need for a truly trusting, faithful king to rule the people. And then chapters 13 through 27, you have this very long sort of, it's Isaiah hearing God's complaint against the people and announcing it. There's a question in the book of Lamentations as to why God is punishing the Israelites so severely when the other nations appear even more wicked. Here, God is speaking through Isaiah to show that they are not immune to his justice anymore, like the other nations. That, what about them? You ever, because, why are you punishing me? What about my brother? That's kind of what's happening here. And Isaiah's coming and saying, oh, no. God sees their wickedness, and they will be punished. Again, he is the holy God of all the earth and supreme over all nations. This isn't just about Israel, but God sees their wickedness. So Isaiah almost is like wanting the Jewish people to see that, like, God has a message for you, but don't do that whole, what about them? No, he sees them, he'll deal with them, but we're also going to deal with you. And then in 28 through 39, you have the story of Hezekiah and the Babylon threat. And this again mirrors 2 Kings 18. Assyria attacks Judah after conquering the north and threatens Jerusalem. They surround the city. They mock the people inside, threatening them, calling them to surrender. But Isaiah prophesies that God will take care of them and calls on King Hezekiah to trust in the Lord, which he does. He's a good king. And he sees a great deliverance. There's some kind of plague or something that kills in the night. We're not really sure, but God shows up. The Holy One comes through. However, in the midst of this, there's this moment where Hezekiah ignores the warning against Babylon, who was another nation that hadn't quite risen to power, and fails to trust God with them. And this ultimately leads to Judah's downfall. Thus, the first section of the book ends by two kings who failed to completely trust God. And this leads to Israel's ultimate collapse. Again, Isaiah is showing you and I, the reader, what is truly needed, which is a faithful, trusting king who will lead the people in righteousness, who will keep their eyes set on the Holy One and call people to be holy, a truly faithful leader and king, a Messiah, an anointed one, leading them away from idolatry. But right now, it's just destruction. It's the end. And then in section 2, picking up in chapters 40 through the end of the book of 66, it now focuses on beyond the destruction, beyond the exile, on Israel's future, pointing ahead beyond their current punishment to the near distant and glorious future and coming king. Chapters 40 through 48, there's sort of like this idea of a second Exodus. Exile will not last forever. You won't be slaves again in Egypt forever. God will once again bring his people out of slavery. Again, second Exodus. Restore the nation, fulfill his promise to Abraham, do what he said he would do to bless the whole world. But here, as opposed to Egypt, the focus is for the whole world, not just for them. And for the first time, you begin to see the message being this was always about more than just this little country. It was about God doing something for all of creation. And then 49 through 55, you see this idea of the Savior King being promised. While Israel is God's servant, Isaiah narrows this down to one particular faithful Israelite, a servant, a leader who will represent the people as king. And this servant will bring the people out of exile and return the nation back to Yahweh, the purpose of a truly faithful king to God's people. So here we have the first mention of the word gospel, good news. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring the gospel, good news. 52 through 53 speaks of the suffering servant who will be raised up, lifted up, and crushed for our iniquities. And this will lead to Israel's redemption and freedom from exile. So through the suffering of this leader, this king, we'll find freedom. Obviously, this is a prophetic announcement of what Jesus would go through, and it's quoted all over the New Testament to speak of Jesus. And then the last 10 chapters, 56 through 66, is really comparing Israel's failure, but also a future glory. It calls for Israel to return to faithfulness. It's like you're going to go through a difficult season, but beyond it, Come back. Don't do this again. Prepare for the coming king by being loyal and being faithful. And repentance is shown to be what is needed for God to restore his people and send the Messiah. They must prepare the way of the Lord by returning to covenant faithfulness. If you want this Messiah to come, if you want to see this all happen, start being what God's called you to be. On the other side of this punishment, on the other side of exile, let's do it right. So Isaiah outlines the future glory of Israel, where the anointed king comes in chapter 61, which Jesus quotes, to bring joy and healing, restoration and newness. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me Messiah to preach good news. All these kind of things. And in the end, God will essentially recreate the heavens and earth, restoring all that's been lost. The lion and lamb will lay down together. The things that are broken, we'll take our swords and beat them back into farming equipment. Essentially, Isaiah is saying it's not over. That's kind of like, it's not over. This exile, this punishment is not the end. There's still hope beyond it. So the big idea of Isaiah, the entire story of Israel so far, points the need to a faithful king. We saw this looking all the way from Joshua, Judges, everyone did what they wanted, 1st and 2nd Samuel, trying to find a good king, David, Solomon, the whole line of kings. It's constantly looking for someone to lead the people well. But Isaiah is the one who finally announces that God will send one. A Messiah is coming, a good king, an anointed one. Isaiah thus is the turning point of the entire Old Testament, setting the stage for what would come, who would come in the person of Jesus. But before we get there, we're going to look at some other prophets who also spoke at the time and fill the picture even more fully for us. So we'll continue next video. Thanks, guys.